famous historian. And ever since world history became popular, I think, he has been around and he's written some very widely used textbooks and is kind of, as far as I know, is focused on this area of world history. It's become his field. And he had some other remarks, perhaps that we didn't mention last time, of why we should study history. For one, and this might seem obvious, and it applies to other fields as well, it helps us to understand people and societies all around the world, all societies, and through time. You have these three different dimensions working. Helps us understand change and how the society we live in came to be. Not only how it is, and we become, I think nowadays, American society and world society to a great extent has become focused just on the present, which is constantly moving, just what is happening right now, rather than understanding the context, which is one of my big criticisms of the news nowadays and almost all talk, is that there is no context so you can understand. That is relative to what? But history gives us that, and the explanation of what came before, what happened before, how did we get to where we are right now? Why is this happening? What is this? The importance of history in our own lives, all around us, whether we realize it or not. Most certainly when you get involved in politics it is, or in this building here, and the university in Omaha, Nebraska, which used to be called Dodge University or Dodge College until it was integrated into the Nebraska University of Nebraska system in the early 1960s, and so forth. It's all around us. How Omaha is designed, city planning in the United States, how cities developed, going back to the 19th century in this case, contributes to moral understanding, which is another side which we hear about a lot. What is morality? What are ethics and immorality? The other side of the coin, and so forth, which is important. It provides identity, most definitely, because it comes back to all of this, and for example, on a very personal basis, this micro basis of the individual, who you are, where you're from, on the level of your family, school again that you go to, because society to a great extent, as we know, raises children once they start off to school to a great extent, and so forth. All the things that go into identity, which is important in many different respects. In fact, in politics, you've probably heard of identity politics. Sometimes it's criticized, the nature of how we talk about politics today, and others promote it. Essential for good citizenship, which is also, it goes into having this knowledge if you participate in politics and how your life is run, and that is the governments on the city level and the state level, county level, and the national level. You need to know what is happening and why, and to inquire about it, know where it comes from, how it's actually supposed to work, government, and the history of that function. All goes into citizenship and what citizenship is. Skills that are developed, Stearns asks, the ability to assess evidence. This is that critical thinking, analytical thinking that's lots of people lament that we don't teach today, or hasn't been taught up to the college level, which we try to get at in the university courses, or at least it's very important for me. And that involves assessing evidence, which means facts. Evidence means what happened, and everything that goes into it. It's kind of like a criminal, and some historians approach it because it's kind of interesting from this as a kind of criminal investigation. Who saw it? Who were the eyewitnesses? How trustworthy are they? What documents do you have? And so forth. Ability to assess conflicting interpretations. Everyone does not interpret those facts, what actually happened, the same way, and giving meaning to it. And one of my professors at the University of Texas at Austin, he talked about that. Even historians, when they study the same field, they don't quite agree oftentimes, and this is natural, on the interpretation of the facts. But he said very importantly, but you can be fair. Now, some historians, like all people, are not always fair. You get into some uncomfortable arguments, but that is important. So you have different interpretations, but you have to support your interpretation, whatever it is. Experience in assessing past examples of change, which the use of the word change is important here because, like I said, historians on the big scale, what they're always doing is looking at change and continuity from period to period over time. And with this, you see those periods of change. For example, in American history, which all of you have studied, a very easy example is the Civil War. And how much did the United States change from before the war, before 1861, and after 1865? And there are debates about this, different interpretations, especially, for example, concerning the South, which lost the war, and how much did the South change? How much was the antebellum South different from the South before the war? Promotes a well-informed citizen, which goes back to citizenship, which takes that knowledge. You need to know something, have knowledge about it in order to participate in society and in government. That's all that Mr. Stearns has. Do you have anything that you can add to that? Yes, sir.
Like certain historical discoveries could help with like scientific discoveries, inventions, something like that.
Right. And throughout history, one of the themes is technology. From very basic, if you want to, from using a stick to dig a row in the ground, to plant seeds, and the beginning of what it comes to be called the Neolithic or the Agricultural Revolution, to the invention of the wheel, to the Hubble telescope, for example, which is sent out into space and which we gain tremendous amount of information about, from. In fact, there was a very interesting show on this morning on the news about that and what scientists are talking about the formation of galaxies or the death of stars and why stars die. But we're going to talk about the beginnings today. But there was something again which I saw this morning on my Facebook or LinkedIn site. There's a group called History Enthusiasts Group, and it puts up articles that come up. And this was one. We're going to talk about the Pantheon, which is in Rome. It's one of these outstanding ancient monuments from the classical period, from Rome. And it's famous, and I'll say some more about it, for its design, especially for its dome, because it was the Romans who began to build domes. Why? Because they invented, and maybe not the beginning, but they modified it, concrete. And concrete allowed you to make shapes, which you couldn't do before. And arches and domes. And the Pantheon has this enormous dome, which I'll show you the inside of. But it showed this. This is the door, made out of iron, I guess bronze or whatever the metal is. But you can think about how much it must weigh, but 25 feet high. And you might ask, and plus Romans were smaller than we are today because of their diets, and as we go through time, human beings get bigger and bigger. But the young lady standing down there at the bottom gives you an idea, scale. Why do you think the Romans built, and you see this in others, if you go to the Capitol in Washington, if you've ever been there in government buildings, you see high ceilings and high doors, much higher, bigger than are necessary. Why do you think that is so? Yes, sir.
It is like a status symbol, they did it because they could do it, and they're just saying like, look at us, look how great we are.
But the look at us is the impression it has on others, right? And this is something, and it's also, there are several things that go into it. This is something, it's still there, Since 115 AD, almost 2 millennia, it is still standing, still working. In fact, it works so well, made of bronze, 7.5 feet wide each door and 25 feet high, but a single person can push or pull it open easily, that door. It is put, the way it is set on the hinges and balance, it is so good, so well made that one person can swing, no matter how much it probably weighs maybe a ton or more than a ton. But enormous. But this is, and the bigger, the larger importance of this is, we'll be talking about monuments, and from the ancient period, almost from the very beginning. People in these civilizations that we talk about begin to build things. Usually they're not many. There's a single building, or for example, the Egyptians, the easy one is the pyramids, that are built for individual pharaohs over a very long period of time, 2 millennia or so. But we'll see lots of these that remain, and some are gone. The 7 wonders of the ancient world, several of them are gone. The great statue of Rhodes, for example. But others remain. And we'll see other examples. And this is one from the Romans. And of course, the other one in Rome is
Colosseum.
Colosseum, that still stands and that you can still go and see. An enormous building. So I wanted to point that out, and I'll do that throughout the semester during class when I see these things. This is something on the Neanderthals learned to make fire before us. I'll maybe come back to that. But to move very quickly, put in your mind the conception of where we're starting at and where we're going to get to the starting point, actually. Think in terms of geological time, which is enormous amounts of time, and you have all these different ages that come before also. If you read things on the geology of the earth, from the time it cooled down, began to form, and everything else. But what we are interested in is this, to begin with, these ice ages, these long periods, and of course today we have this whole climate change, we see climate changing around us, but very, very rapidly compared with these past changes in temperature, which has always happened. During the time of Napoleon, there was what they called the small ice age. It was a cooling, it warmed back up. But the Pleistocene age, about 2.5 million years ago, and then you have one of these ages, and of course it goes back to the dinosaurs and all these extinct animals and the mastodons and so forth, who also died out and became extinct during these times of changes in temperature, which means they're changing their environment, which is when new species come into being. But we'll go back to the Ice Age, the last great Ice Age. This is the last one, in which from 2 million to 10,000 BCE, an enormous, almost incomprehensible period of time for us. And then, during that time, you have, and we won't talk very much about the different forms of hominids, the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnon, and you get to the Homo sapien, and things about those, and living at the same time, Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. But you have the Old Stone Age, which is that Paleolithic time, again, a very, very, very long time. And this is one of our themes of going through the class, is time is going to shorten as we move up towards the present. But you have that, and that date of 10,000 BCE, roughly, all of these are roughly, is what is important, because that marks the end, but there is no definite mark. Gradually the glaciers recede, the average temperature warms up, and so forth. That is what is important. But here, This shows you in the blue, if you can see this, are the areas that were covered by glaciers. The ice came down from the North Pole. Now, of course, it's receding at a very rapid rate, faster than the rest of the planet from what I understand. But it covers North America, almost down a little bit maybe south of the US-Canadian border, and all across North America. And then, of course, Northern Europe is covered, Great Britain, the British Isles, Scandinavia, northern part of Europe, and across north of Russia. And then the green parts, because all of this water is locked up in ice, these glaciers, it's actually been transformed through the atmosphere into rain or snow or ice that has come down in the northern parts, and that's why it accumulates. And that necessarily results in what? We have cause and effect here, a rising or lowering of the oceans, as water is transferred to the poles. And so you have all of these areas, for example, in Indonesia and Malaysia and the Southeast Pacific, which are now islands. You have thousands and thousands of islands. They were all connected, which helps to explain the spread of species, including Homo sapiens. Japan was also connected to Asia. The Bering Strait, North America and Siberia were connected. And the coastline all around North America and South America was expanded out a great distance into the ocean, all around. Which, like I said, that helps to explain the spread, especially for us, of man. Now, it's through these fields of archaeology and anthropology and various other fields, scientific analysis, that we have come to understand a lot of this knowledge that exists before we have any writing systems. But you have the hominids, the form of the human form. The Neanderthals existed from approximately 200,000 to 30,000 BCE. And Homo sapiens across from 200,000 to 150,000 to now. So you see where the overlap comes. So that's why there's been recent articles about interaction, actually interbreeding between them. That's why I said last time we all have a little bit of Neanderthal DNA in us. And originally, all of these hominids originated, as far as we know, in East Africa, from the plains, which are called savannas, which are these vast grasslands south of the Sahara, which the Sahara also didn't exist the way it is today until after 1500 BC, when the weather changed again in this part of the world. It wasn't all desert in the Arabian Peninsula either. And you had more of grassland before that. So from the savannas of East Africa, you have these hominids that spread out, different kinds over time, this dispersion from Africa. There was a movie called Out of Africa with Robert Redford and I forget the actress, Glenn Close, I forget. But you have the migrations across the 4 continents. The Americas, North America and South America, which we'll talk about. Also in Europe and Asia and Africa, and also to the Asia Pacific, into Australia. And you have this adaptation that takes place over very, very, very long periods of time of these various kinds of hominids, including Homo sapiens, which we'll say a little bit more about. But you also have diversity that develops over these long, long periods of times as these hominids go out and wander across totally virgin territory, a landscape, and change it themselves for a very, very long time until the advent of civilization, actually, hardly at all. And they themselves begin to exhibit change. There is diversity that comes about in race, and as we know, Peking man, Cro-Magnons in Africa, there are different kinds of hominids begin to develop over time, adapting to their environments, changes in genes, and so forth. And culture. And the reason I mention culture, and just to give you one example, is that there is evidence that these hominids, long, long, long before the advent of civilization, practiced burial as early as 100,000 years ago, for whatever reason the conception was, long before we had any kind of organized religion, or whatever that means. And then you have the lifestyles that we talked about last time, you read about in your readings also, during this long period of time moving up towards the advent of civilization, the foraging and hunting and gathering, which all did, in groups or clans, wondering about this vast landscape, enormous, across it, for a very, very, very long period of time, with nothing changing for eons. Now this is another map that gives us an idea of how these hominids spread across the continents, coming out, originating here. And these show you where some of the important digs, discoveries comes from, the information about the earliest, and why scientists believe that this is where the hominids began. But they spread into Southeast Asia, across North America, and up into Europe, over to India, into China, and then across these islands, which during the time when, during that last ice age, all of this is land. And they can easily, but they also, of course, people spread by boat also, which is how people got to Hawaii, out in the middle of the Pacific, and many other islands, and down to Australia. So you have that, there's another one here that I wanted to show you, which has a kind of a different pattern. But it shows you over this very, very long period of time, just to take one example, coming from the savannas of Africa, going all the way across the largest continent, Asia, across the Bering Strait, eventually, over tens of thousands of years, these hominids end up at the end of South America, wandering, and through this vast variety of landscapes, of swamps, deserts, forests, plains, and so forth, which has never, of course, like I said, been touched. It's only been changed by the environment and the weather and the earth itself. But knowing all of this, why did long-range migration take place? Why do you think people did that? Yes, sir.
Maybe it was kind of just following like the animals and keeping track of them, so they had
Right.
just daily life, really.
Right.
It's not like they were.
There is also, we can also, and this is something we're going to see throughout history, is that as they start to increase, you have clans, they have conflicts. One clan forces another clan to go to the next valley, and so forth. But certainly like that, if you're hunting, think about Native Americans, Indians, Plains Indians, and the importance of the buffalo. And they follow the buffalo, they have to know everything about the buffalo movements and behaviors, and follow the herds because they rely on it. Yes, that's one reason that we can think about. It caused these hominids to spread over all this vast territory. Why did diversity take place if all had the same origins?
History, like their stories could have been told a little different each time somebody got farther and farther away. The story would change maybe a little bit. They didn't all recall it as the same thing.
In terms of in terms of culture, and this is something oral culture, telling these stories, of course, goes back to before the advent of writing systems and continues today, right? We still use it all the time. But also, in talking about diversity, if they all came out of East Africa, why did changes take place? And this guy goes back in terms of their appearance and race and ethnicity also, which is below race. This develops because of adaptation to environments over long periods of time. In fact, one of the things that I read about recently, which quite perhaps figures into this, is you tend to have pale-skinned people from Northern Europe in the north, right? Scandinavia. And this has to do with the sun, the exposure to the sun, and adaptation to little exposure to the sun, and which causes problems when those people go down around the equator, and so forth. So you have this adaptation which is constantly going on, and again, it goes on today. Why did some societies remain nomadic? And you have nomads today, still in the world, which we'll talk about. This is kind of moving a little bit farther. This is the Neolithic Revolution, which we're going to talk about. So why don't we come back to that question, because Mr. Green is going to bring it up. Why didn't all societies change together? Once societies appear, and this perhaps comes back to the same thing, and this is what we're going to see when history comes, when you actually have civilization appearing, is that societies, they're different, right? And even in recent history, all societies are not the same in all aspects, for example, in economic performance or in technology or lots of other different areas. And this, again, has to do with environment. It may have to do with lots of different things, and get into culture and education and all kinds of things. It becomes very complicated. What led to the development of cities and states? We're going to deal with that next, okay? But this gets us up to that last ice age and what comes after it. Which is basically this, the Neolithic Revolution, or it's also called the Agricultural Revolution. And this, again, is not something that happens quickly and all of a sudden appears. It happens very, very, very gradually, but only in some certain places, or at the beginning. And this is what you had, the Paleolithic times was the Old Stone Age, but now you have the New Stone Age that comes after the end of that last ice age, after very, very roughly that 10,000 BC. This just gives you an idea of when the ice began to recede significantly. And you have this shift to the cultivation of plants from that foraging and hunting, gathering lifestyle that had existed for almost 200,000 years, for a very, very long time. And along with the cultivation of plants, or the domestication of plants, which some people also use, you have the domestication of animals also appears. Now this begins the very first beginnings, putting a few seeds in the ground, you might say. After that ice age in 10,000 BC, 9,000 to 8,000. One of the earliest places that we have discovered, that has been discovered so far, where there is evidence of people, Homo sapiens, actually having intentionally planted plants, was in the Zagros Mountains. Does anybody know where the Zagros Mountains are? It's a range of mountains between modern-day Iran and Iraq, to the east of Mesopotamia. And there is evidence of a primitive form of wheat. And of course, the beginnings is all primitive. In Central America, you have a primitive form of maize, or corn, as we call it today, the predecessor of the corn that we grow so much of here in Nebraska, also, which is very different from modern day corn, and this also very different from modern day wheat. It's called Immer. There's evidence that is perhaps one of the first places where people began to cultivate grains, to grow things on a very, very, very small scale. This, to move up, and Mr. Green is going to talk about it also in the video I want to show you. leads, again, over a long period of time, several thousand years, to trade and the emergence of professions. And we'll say some more about that. But once you produce something, and not to say that foragers and gatherers couldn't trade also with other clans, for example, or peoples, but when you begin to become stationary, which you necessarily have to be in order to grow crops, and you have to plant them, and you have to stay with them until they grow up, and then harvest them, so forth. This leads to, in some ways, an end to that wandering life, not completing. But in time, it leads to complex societies, which I'll be mentioning most of the semester, because the history that we study is basically the increasing complexity of societies all the way up until now. This is another one of those big themes that we see. From the time societies come into existence, communities, or however you define them, however many people are in one, which leads to city-states. In time, it leads to centralized governments. This is looking very farther on, but we're trying to get an idea of how all this begins, And once it starts, then of course it never ends, all the way until now. How many of you know who John Green is? And you know him from his books, right? No?
No.
You know him from Crash Course? Okay.
Oh, is that who that is? Okay.
Huh? John Green, I didn't know. When I started teaching, I found these videos, because I found they're very useful. And he's made this whole series, 20 years now or so. He says his brother Hank and his high school history teacher began making these history videos. But he's the only one who performs, and it is a performance. He's a very interesting character. How many of you read any of his books? Like Turtles All the Way Down, and there's some others that are bestsellers I didn't know for adolescents, and they're all about girls. But he was on 60 Minutes, the news program, a year ago, and it was interesting because he has problems with depression, and he was talking about personal things which you would get no idea from the videos. But he's very interesting, and he has lots of interesting videos. You can find them on YouTube, but lots of other things too, not just history, but periods of history, and goes into them, and he encapsulates the material very well. And I'll just show you. This is John Green, okay? He has Looking for Alaska, An Abundance of Catherine's, Paper Towns, The Fault in Our Stars, Turtle All the Way Down, Never Seen Reviewed, and Crash Course, of course. But we're going to look at this, maybe, are we?
Market options that are worth my time. We need a team of local experts we can count on. A co-op that's in it to help us all every day.
How well do you know your...
Hello, learned and astonishingly attractive pupils. My name is John Green, and I want to welcome you to Crash Course World History. Over the next 40 weeks, together, we will learn how in a mere 15,000
Can you hear that okay?
years, humans went from hunting and gathering.
Mr. Green, is this going to be on the test?
Yeah, about the test. The test will measure whether you are an informed, engaged, and productive
this is
citizen of the
laptop?
world. And it will take place in schools
It's in
and
every
bars
single
and
video.
hospitals and dorm rooms and in places of worship. You will be tested on first dates, in job interviews, while watching football, and while scrolling through your Twitter feed. The test will judge your ability to think about things other than celebrity marriages, whether you'll be easily persuaded by empty political rhetoric, and whether you'll be able to place your life and your community in a broader context. The test will last your entire life, and it will be comprised of the millions of decisions that, when taken together, make your life yours, and everything everything will be on it. I know, right? So pay attention. In a mere 15,000 years, humans went from hunting and gathering to creating such improbabilities as the airplane, the internet, and the 99-cent double cheeseburger. It's an extraordinary journey, one that I will now symbolize by embarking upon a journey of my own. Over to camera 2. Hi there, camera 2, it's me, John Green. Let's start with that double cheeseburger. Oh, food photography. So this hot hunk of meat contains 490 calories. To get this cheeseburger, you have to feed, raise, and slaughter cows, then grind their meat, then freeze it, and ship it to its destination. You also gotta grow some wheat and then process the living crap out of it until it's whiter than Queen Elizabeth I. Then you gotta milk some cows and turn their milk into cheese. And that's not even to mention the growing and pickling of cucumbers, or the sweetening of tomatoes, or the grinding of mustard seeds, etc. How in the sweet name of everything holy did we ever come to live in a world in which such a thing can even be created? And how is it possible that those 490 calories can be served to me for an amount of money that if I make the minimum wage here in the US, I can earn in 11 minutes? And most importantly, should I be delighted or alarmed to live in this strange world of relative abundance? Well, to answer that question, we're not going to be able to look strictly at history because there isn't a written record about a lot of these things, but thanks to archaeology and paleobiology, we can look deep into the past. Let's go to the thought bubble. So 15,000 years ago, humans were foragers and hunters. Foraging meant gathering fruits, nuts, also wild grains and grasses. Hunting allowed for a more protein-rich diet, so long as you could find something with meat to kill. By far the best hunting gig in the prehistoric world, incidentally, was fishing, which is one of the reasons that if you look at the history of people populating the planet, we tended to run for the shore and then stay there. Marine life was A, abundant, and B, relatively unlikely to eat you. While we tend to think that the lives of foragers were nasty, brutish, and short, fossil evidence suggests that they actually had it pretty good. Their bones and teeth are healthier than those of agriculturalists, and anthropologists who've studied the remaining forager peoples have noted that they actually spend a lot fewer hours working than the rest of us, and they spend more time on art, music, and storytelling. Also, if you believe the classic of anthropology, Nisa, they also have a lot more time for scoodly pooping. What? I call it scoodly pooping. I'm not going to apologize. It's worth noting that cultivation of crops seems to have arisen independently over the course of millennia in a number of places, from Africa to China to the Americas, using crops that naturally grew nearby: rice in Southeast Asia, maize in Mexico, potatoes in the Andes, wheat in the Fertile Crescent, yams in West Africa. People around the world began to
One of the things to point out here is how this Neolithic revolution takes place in these different places independently. There is no connection. Later there's going to be, within these regions that I was talking about last time. Also, the word diversity comes up again. The people in these different places where the cultivation of crops began, domestication of animals, have to use what they have, which is different from these widely divergent places, which also leads to changes, affects the societies that emerge.
abandon their foraging for agriculture. And since so many communities made this choice independently, it must have been a good choice, right? Even though it meant less music and scoodly pooping. Thanks, Thought Bubble. All right, to answer that question, let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of agriculture. Advantage: controllable food supply. You might have droughts or floods, but if you're growing the crops and breeding them to be hardier, you have a better chance of not starving. Disadvantage: in order to keep feeding people as the population grows, you have to radically change the environment of the planet. Advantage: especially if you grow grain, you can create a food surplus, which makes cities possible, and also the specialization of labor. Like in the days before agriculture, everybody's job was foraging, and it took about 1,000 calories of work to create 1,000 calories of food. And it was impossible to create large population centers. But if you have a surplus, agriculture can support people not directly involved in the production of food. Like, for instance, tradespeople who can devote their lives to better farming equipment, which in turn makes it easier to produce more food more efficiently, which in time makes it possible for a corporation to turn a profit on this 99-cent double cheeseburger. This is delicious, by the way. It's actually terrible, and it's very cold, and I wish I had not eaten it. I mean, can we just compare what I was promised to what I was delivered? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is not that. Some would say that large and complex agricultural communities that can support cities and eventually inexpensive meat sandwiches are not necessarily beneficial to the planet or even to its human inhabitants. Although that's a bit of a tough argument to make, coming to you as I am in a series of ones and zeros. Advantage, agriculture can be practiced all over the world, although in some cases it takes extensive manipulation of the environment, like, irrigation, controlled flooding, terracing, that kind of thing. Disadvantage, farming is hard. So hard, in fact, that one is tempted to claim ownership over other humans and then have them till the land on your behalf, which is the kind of non-ideal social order that tends to be associated with agricultural communities. So why did agriculture happen? Wait, I haven't talked about herders. Herders, man, always getting the short end of the stick. Herding is a really good and interesting alternative to foraging and agriculture. You domesticate some animals and then you take them on the road with you. The advantages of herding are obvious. First, you get to be a cowboy. Also, animals provide meat and milk, but they also help out with shelter because they can provide wool and leather. The downside is that you have to move around a lot because your herd always needs new grass, which makes it hard to build cities unless you are the Mongols. By the way, over the
Well, he's going to say it. Every single video has that scene of the Mongols.
next 40 weeks, you will frequently hear generalizations followed by, unless you are the Mongols. But anyway, one of the main reasons herding only caught
Except for which video? The one about the Mongols.
on in certain parts of the world is that there aren't that many animals that lend themselves to domestication. Like you have sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, horses, camels, donkeys, reindeer, water buffalo, yaks, all of which have something in common. They aren't native to the Americas. The only halfway useful herding animal native to the Americas is the llama. No, not that llama. 2 L's. Yes, that llama. Most animals just don't work for domestication. Like hippos are large, which means they provide lots of meat, but unfortunately they like to eat people. Zebras are too ornery. Grizzlies have wild hearts that can't be broken. Elephants are awesome, but they take way too long to breed. Which reminds me, it's time for the open letter. Elegant. But first, let's see what the secret compartment has for me today. Oh, it's another double cheeseburger. Thanks, secret compartment. Just kidding. I don't thank you for this. An open letter to elephants. Hey, elephants, you're so cute and smart and awesome. Why you gotta be pregnant for 22 months? That's crazy. And then you only have 1 kid. If you were more like cows, you might have taken us over by now. Little did you know, but the greatest evolutionary advantage? Being useful to humans. Like here is a graph of cow population, and here is a graph of elephant population. Elephants, if you just inserted yourself into human life the way cows did, you could have used your power and intelligence to form secret elephant societies conspiring against the humans. And then you could have risen up and destroyed us and made an awesome elephant world with elephant cars and elephant planes. It would have been so great, but no, you gotta be pregnant for 22 months and then have just 1 kid. It's so annoying. Best wishes, John Green. Right, but back to the agricultural revolution and why it occurred. Historians don't know for sure, of course, because there are no written records, but they love to make guesses. Maybe population pressure necessitated agriculture even though it was more work, or abundance gave people leisure to experiment with domestication, or planting originated as a fertility right, or, as some historians have argued, people needed to domesticate grains in order to produce more alcohol. Charles Darwin, like most 19th century scientists, believed agriculture was an accident, saying, a wild and unusually good variety of native plant might attract the attention of some wise old savage. Off topic, but you will note in the coming weeks that the definition of savage tends to be not me. Maybe the best theory is that there wasn't really an agricultural revolution at all, but that agriculture came out of an evolutionary desire to eat more. Like early hunter-gatherers knew that seeds germinate when planted, and when you find something that makes food, you want to do more of it. Unless it's just food, then you want to do less of it. I kind of want to spit it out. Oh, that's much better. So early farmers would find the most accessible forms of wheat and plant them and experiment with them, not because they were trying to start an agricultural revolution, because they were like, you know what would be awesome? More food. Like on this topic, we have evidence that more than 13,000 years ago, humans in southern Greece were domesticating snails. In the Frosty Cave, there's a huge pile of snail shells. Most of them are larger than current snails, suggesting that the people who ate them were selectively breeding them to be bigger and more nutritious. Snails make excellent domesticated food sources, by the way, because A, surprisingly caloric.
Interesting, huh? It encapsulates everything. Anybody have any questions? How many people have worked on a farm? Any of you? No? I did too. Started when I was 15, but I drove a great big John Deere tractor. It wasn't that difficult, huh? So on Friday, we'll pick up from here. This Neolithic revolution now